Boy, real life is stranger than any fiction. And I think we're in for a very interesting next 10 weeks.
So that was Paul Jacob concluding This Week in Common Sense, his podcast from several weeks ago at the end of August. I helped Paul make his podcasts, and what he did, we talked for another half hour after the end of his podcast, and I cut it out. It was just so long. And it also, there was too much me in it. So wait, if there's too much me in his podcast, then maybe I'll make it my podcast. So that was the proposal I made for Paul, and he's consented to have a crossover episode. So here we are. And the theme that I played here was basically, it's worse. It's actually worse than you're saying. Just how amazingly bad the situation is for Democrats especially, but for so many people in the current predicament, is just how weird it's getting. I think one of the main reasons for the weirdness, and I bring this up towards the end, is that we're dealing with a problem of the commons. The commons, in this case, being the resources, the tax-based resources of the federal government. And we live in a multicultural society that is a pluralistic society, and that is not stable. That is something we need to talk about more. This is a major important finding of social science, is this idea of democratic instability. But really in this podcast with Paul Jacob, who is the president of Citizens in Charge and Citizens in Charge Foundation and Liberty Initiative Fund, and has been writing commentary at thisiscommonsense.org since 1999, the main thrust of what we were talking about is not really a theory of democratic instability. It's a theory of Democratic Party insanity. And I think one of the reasons for their insanity actually is the problem that Shepsle and Rabushka talk about in A Theory of Democratic Instability. It's an important book. I didn't know about that book until fairly recently, a few years ago. But I knew the basic idea because I have been reading Herbert Spencer and William Graham Sumner for years, and also Volney, C.F. Volney, who basically gave the same thesis, is that the problem with empires, the problem with any big state, is that they ruin themselves when they try to rearrange all the public resources. You basically have to have enlightened self-interest limited by the rule of law, and not this big mercantilist or neo-mercantilist transfer state. That's what we have now, and it's just a bad system. That's why I bring up the problem quite often, is that this is what we face today, and it's driving us crazy. And it's driving us also not merely crazy, but broke. And one of the reasons we're broke and in debt is the result of all the inherent contradictions in late-stage churning state capitalism. So, let's go to Paul. Basically, you heard Paul say at the beginning that it's going to be quite a run-up to the next election. It's going to get weird, and since our talk in late August, the fires broke out, and a lot of that's terroristic activity from people associated with Black Bloc or Antifa or just any leftoid set of ideas. They believe that any country that would elect Donald Trump deserves to be destroyed, and that they're also making a threat that if you re-elect Trump, they're going to destroy it all completely. That's the idea. And so we're in a very interesting time right now, but we don't quite talk about how bad that's getting. Right now, why are Democrats so crazy? And they are very, very crazy. And the left is generally nuts. And why is that the case? I believe I address it at the end of the segment I'm just going to play for you right now. So, here we are. This is the LocoFoco Netcast. My name is Timothy Virkkala, and I'm talking to Paul Jacob. This whole Biden thing I find is hilarious. I mean, this is not just amazing. It's funny because, they've been objecting for, the Democrats have, with one voice, have said that Donald Trump is unfit for office. He's not psychologically capable of doing it. He's, blah, blah, blah. Well, Biden has all that too, and he has the obvious dementia elements, or seemingly obvious dementia elements, to sort of prove it, where you don't have the proof so obvious. I mean, Trump is, they say, a narcissist. Well, all politicians are to some degree, but Biden...
To some degree, that's very nice of you to say.
But, boy, it's as if that they object to one thing and then they up the ante and do it even more themselves. Because Biden is also corrupt in Ukraine. They charged for years, 2 or 3 years, that Trump was corrupt and a toady of the Russians. And Biden is admired in a weird scandal in the Ukraine as well as in China with his son and with, it's just obviously corrupt. We just don't know how much.
Think about the fact that it's not even that shocking that with the biggest issue at the moment being criminal justice and police misconduct, that you have the Democrats putting forward, blaming everything on Trump, who, as a Republican president, got some criminal justice reform done. Not that he didn't go nearly as far as he should. I mean, all over the country, the country's ready to go much further than any of the legislatures or Congress has gone, because they all are sucking up to the police unions because they want their endorsement come election time. So, you know, it's really disappointing that more hasn't happened. But Trump has done something about it. And if you were to pick two Democratic candidates who are the worst on these issues, it's Joe Biden who pushed through the crime bill way back when, and who wanted to go after the super predators and mandatory minimums and no knock and be tough. And Kamala Harris, as a prosecutor, now when she ran for president, it was on what was the show? I forget the name. Interesting show. It's a very, very popular in the Black community, and I can't think of the name of it.
It's not Charlemagne the God's show, is it?
It may be that one, but it may be that one. It's one of them that I'm not sure that's it, but she went on and laughed about how, of course, she smoked marijuana and so on. And, you know, look, I don't think it's horrible for someone to have smoked marijuana. So laugh about it. Hey, that's great. Fine. Except you put a bunch of people in prison for doing the same thing. And she seems to think that you can just turn the clock. I mean, I have to say, she comes out of the Willie Brown mold. And you know, he got her a lot of her initial jobs. They dated shortly, and there's been all kinds of ridiculously obnoxious, misogynistic, probably actually even fits this time, things said about her and her relationship with Willie Brown. I'm not saying any of those are going anywhere close to that, because it's disgusting. It's disgusting to say it. People are allowed to have relationships, but it is true politically that it's disgusting, because the last person in the world politically I'd ever want a relationship with is Willie Brown, the former Ayatollah of the Assembly in California, someone I view as corrupt. And she certainly has, you know, climbed the ladder successfully for her. But part of that success has been to have two standards. One, for her, it's okay to smoke marijuana, but for other people, they're going to go to prison. And she's the person sending them to prison, prosecuting them and sending them to prison. So I have a lot of problems with her. And that whole ticket, it just seems to me that it's pretty clear there are all kinds of issues that are consensus issues among the American people. And we are just have to watch these lunatics who are not going to do anything about them. And so, you know, I think people who sometimes say, well, the public, you know, gets what it wants. No, we don't. And the funny thing is, it's not like, hey, the Democrats get what they want when they're in charge. No, they don't. And I'm talking about the rank and file. The Republicans don't get what they're in charge. The independents, we don't get anything ever. The politicians do for them. And that's, I've said this for years. You know, if you look at you know, what it's like to be a politician, their world's pretty good. Their salaries have gone up. They pick stocks like nobody's business with all their insider information. You got a lot of people who sure have made a great economic move by becoming a politician. And you've got a country that is horribly unrepresented. And it's beginning to be a life and death issue.
it gets even worse. Because think about this. There was only one woman of color in the Democratic race who got a delegate, and she was pointedly not invited to the convention. Tulsi
Yes,
Gabbard.
yes.
Tulsi Gabbard. I mean, they just didn't want her. They don't want her message. They don't want anything to do with less government overseas or.
And they don't have any commitment to any sort of process. That delegate that she picked up was, when she picked it up, guaranteed her a place in the next debate. And the DNC got together and changed the rules so that now that you have, and what was her big crime? That she calls them like she sees them. She's not saluting and kneeling before the DNC. And she went to see Bashar al-Assad, and she is against constant war around the world for regime change. The truth is she's not horribly radical, as if, we have to pull every troop out of every place in the world. Her real attack has been on regime change wars. And frankly, even the idiots who get us into those wars don't think regime change wars make a lot of sense, and are always, how many times did George W. Bush talk about no nation building and that sort of thing, and then he becomes president and he's out nation building everywhere? Or Barack Obama talk about a different sort of foreign policy, and then decide, in his spare time he'll help NATO knock off Gaddafi and destabilize that region. This is there's an awful lot of criticism that I think ought to be leveled, and the one person on the Democratic side willing to level it, willing to say something different than all the others, is silenced.
So that's what the Democratic Party is. I mean, I think I know. I have my theories why. I think that they're basically ad hoc to the deep state. They are the public expression of the deep state, but they use leftist politics as their lost leader, their cover, their mask.
Right. It's identity politics, but the real identity is they are the government. The biggest spender in elections are the public employees unions. That's the biggest spender. And so that's the government spending money to keep the government big and employing people like them. And so, and then, that's not even, we're not even counting the teachers unions. They come in and so on. And look, everybody has a right to be political and to speak out and so on. But it's always been interesting to me that a lot of times I get involved in initiative campaigns. And if you're fighting the public employees unions, especially as we did over Taxpayer Bill of Rights and things like that, the media is always looking for some angle where our side gets some self-interest, something that helps them financially. Even when they can't find it, they kind of allude to it being there, but never can understand. They just can't understand what we're talking about when we suggest that the people spending money to stop control on government spending are the people who work for the government, and that they have a vested interest. I've never seen that discussed in the media. It's like they cannot understand that concept. Or, here's another case in point that takes it a little bit away from it's still government employee unions, but another a little different point. In California years ago, they had an initiative that would have allowed first-time marijuana busts, people arrested for marijuana, to get some sort of psychiatric or mental health or something other than going to jail. I didn't think that probably made the most sense, but it's better than sending them to jail. And so I would have voted yes for that reason, even though I just assumed they just legalized it, as they have now. The money against that initiative, which was about treatment instead of incarceration, 100% of the money on the no side came from the prison workers union in California. They were spending money to say, yes, we want our business to stay in business and to be thriving by continuing to criminalize people. Now, maybe they believe that's the right thing, but for people not to notice that self-interest, and to regularly for the media not to see the self-interest of the political class is troubling to me.
Yeah, well, I consider this is an expression of one of the most fundamental truths about society, which was developed by the classical liberals like James Mill and the French theorists of the early 1800s. The historical school of industrialism, or however you pronounce it, is industrialism. The idea was that there is a class warfare going on, but class warfare is not about the classes that we think of. It's between those people who have insider power and those who do not. And this is the classic case of that. And I find it amusing that right now the Democrats have sort of these goons raising a havoc who are Marxists, who hold to a different class theory, whereas the rich people are bad and the poor people are exploited. And I consider that to be a diversion from the truth, and the truth is expressed in the Democratic Party.
Yes. Yeah, I would agree with you wholeheartedly there that it's the insiders
versus the outsiders.
versus the outsiders.
Yeah. But the Republicans, many of the politicians know this, but they have been unable to do anything about it for a number of reasons. It could be cowardice, but I think mainly it's because most Republicans, though they know this, they don't really feel it. And I think that Republicans, normal Republicans have a problem with what they really believe about government, because they like to believe one thing, but they kind of believe something else. And that's why Republican politicians are always betraying them. I mean, that's why we have Donald Trump. It's because Republican politicians have been awful for 50 years. I mean, they can't really do it. They can't do what they sometimes promise. And it's just pissed off the Republicans. But the Republicans themselves have issues. And so I think Americans have to face up to a few issues, like insiders, outsiders, like that one. That one's a good one to face up to.
I think Americans get that. I think the public gets the insiders versus outsiders. I think that is the way they see it oftentimes. And it might not be what they'd express, but if you say that, I think you'd find, you could be in a lot of different rooms and you would find widespread agreement.
You get about 40% of the population, I think, for that. But then when it comes to their program, how they get money from the government, then it gets a little bit difficult. No one on Social Security wants to get their Social Security checks even frozen. They don't want that frozen, and they don't want it reduced, that's for sure. They don't want it reformed because they like what they have. People on welfare, Medicare, Medicaid.
No, the system, they put little things that suck you in. For instance, I think it's ridiculous that you get a tax deduction for the interest you pay on your home mortgage. At the same time, when my wife and I purchased our first home, she came to me and she said, she's the smart one. She came to me and she said, we need to buy a home. And I said to her, honey, we can't pay our bills. How are we going to buy a home? And she showed me the arithmetic, which was that we could buy a home and pay less because of the tax advantages, pay less a month, gaining equity than we're paying in rent. Well, I'm not dumb. I said, let's do it. It was a very good move to make. But the catalyst was the tax policy. So I would have been really irked if 2 years later they changed the law and all of a sudden that's not the tax policy anymore. And so it's a little bit like people who have paid into Social Security all this time. It's not quite right that they don't get anything back because the program goes belly up. At the same time, it's not quite right that you're taking somebody else's money who's 20 years old today and paying, in other words, that it's not a sustainable program in which there are actually lock boxes or at least some fund that has the politicians' hands off of it. And so this is it's a real big problem, I think, because you have to be careful people are not going to say, yes, that's the right thing to do, but now I'm 79 years old and I don't really want to give up my Social Security because I'll have to move out of my house and I can't go back and get a job. And so and I've known people who, if some libertarian actually accepts Social Security, they're a hypocrite. And I'm thinking, they've paid in all their life. They've made the argument against the program. And I've known many libertarians who were more well-to-do who would donate their Social Security check every month. But I suspect I may need a little bit of it to help pay the bills, to live in the lap of luxury here. So anyway, all of this, I think, goes to how easy it is to suck people in and how government is very good at making it to where you have a financial incentive not to, we're going to pay you off a little bit. And it's almost as if they've convinced people we pay $10, but we get $12 back. Well, I'll do that all day long. That's good. But that's not how it works. That's not how it could work. We pay $12 and we get $10 back if we're lucky, if we're extremely lucky. So anyway, getting people to see that is one thing. And then getting a plan, a strategy for how you move in a more free, citizen-controlled, less insider-controlled system and start to do away with some of these mistaken policies. But you do have to be very careful. I think it's why libertarians have been much, much more in favor of getting rid of what I would call daddy welfare, corporate welfare, before you got rid of welfare at the individual level and for the poor. At the same time, I look at some of the welfare stuff and I think, if we don't ever get rid of it, you always have this problem. Like I'd like for our country to take in more people, especially if we're not going to have birth rates that allow us to be sustainable in population. But you can't accept all kinds of people coming in or make it easier for people to get in if you've got a gigantic welfare state. One, you're not going to have the support for it. And the reason you don't have the support is because people go, you know what, I can just afford so much. So it's a huge problem about how we get from where we are to where we want to go. And I'm more and more convinced that one of the keys for libertarians having any success is to figure that out. We know we have no success showing the beautiful city on the hill at the end. Nobody wants to walk 4 steps to get to that city. So we have to come back and say, okay, let's take step 1 and sell step 1. And if we can't sell step 1, we're never going to sell the city on the hill.
Harry Browne thought he had an answer to it. Remember Harry Browne's deal that he wanted everybody to take?
I don't remember the deal. I remember his great line that I want a government small enough to fit inside the Constitution.
That is a great line. Yeah, no, his deal was, it's been a long time. I mean, now it's 30 years or something, 25 years. But his deal was, would you get rid of all the government benefits if we got rid of all the taxes? He says, you have to make a deal. You have to give people benefits for taking away their benefits. There has to be a deal somehow. And he thought that would be the way to do it. I'm not sure that quite works, but I think that something's there. I actually think the United States has to be dissolved and we have to put it under receivership, bankruptcy proceedings, and pay off the biggest creditors right away. And I think the biggest creditors probably should be Social Security recipients, probably 50 years and older or something like that. That probably makes the most sense to me. But I don't think the United States, if the Democrats keep pushing these crazy rioters and Marxists and so forth, we're done. This is not a going concern. But you kind of hope that they're going to get over this, right?
Well, they won't get over it. I mean, they will keep pushing it until they're defeated. There's the slightest chance that a second Trump term might wake somebody up over there, but I'm skeptical. And part of it is what they're doing in essence is driving the sort of wedge that could change the white community into more of what they demonize the white community for being. In other words, if I know that I have a 30% chance of being killed if I'm in the black community by myself, I'm not going to be in the black community. If I know that, if you start calculating my race is this, their race is that, I can't be here, I got to be, all of a sudden, white people get no credit for being the most multicultural of any of the cultures, literally the pinnacle. But at a certain point, you destroy that. At a certain point, you start to cause white people to say, fuck this. We got to have our own place. And you do that. America's gone if you do that. But it's not just that America's gone, because they want America gone. But the amount of suffering, the amount of, if people with wealth start to leave the country, and start to hide it, and what the forces they are, I think, creating are more destructive for them and their people than they are for the white folks.
That reminds me, of course, of the whole deal with Mr. Richard Spencer, who likes the welfare state. And he's a racist because he wants the welfare state to continue for his people.
Yes.
And this goes back to a book written by Rabushka and Shepsle back in 72, I think it was, or early 70s, late 60s. And it's a theory of democratic instability. And we've never discussed this. I mentioned this, and you said you wanted to talk about it someday.
Yes.
And it's a really interesting book. Well, actually, it's a great thesis, and they demonstrate it really well, but it is the driest book I've ever tried to read in the last 20 years. Okay, so no wonder people don't talk about it much. But his thesis is simply, well, you can put it in the classical liberal terms, libertarian terms. If you want a diverse society, you can't have very many public goods. You can't have the government supplying lots of public goods. It has to be a limited government, because every community has to provide their own public goods. If you want a government that provides lots of public goods like welfare and social security and all that stuff, then you have to be a monoculture, because there's what we now call tragedy, the commons problems takes over.
Right.
And I think it's absolutely true. And this is, I think, where libertarians could actually confront everybody with this problem and say, we're for diversity, but you can't have the thing that you think diversity demands, because actually it also explains why are they so relentlessly ideological and so nasty with all this woke stuff. It's because they have to have a monoculture. So they're creating a monoculture of ideology. Right. This is actually very similar to what Republicans have done. Nationalists. We have an American nationalism. We're nationalists. We're Americans. We're not this or that. And that helps create the monoculture. Democrats are destroying the Republican monoculture, or that is the Lincolnian monoculture of nationalism, of Americanism. And they're trying to replace it with this woke stuff. It's not going to work because real diversity requires small government. But getting that message across, I don't see libertarians even trying.
It's tough. But that does sound like something worth trying.
Thanks, Paul. But I'm not done yet. The book I've mentioned here and cited, I've miscited. It's Politics in Plural Societies, A Theory of Democratic Instability by Rabushka and Shepsle. So there we are. This is a book that I encountered fairly recently, but it sort of brings home a thesis I've long understood because I have read Herbert Spencer. Here's two examples: his famous Social Statics, and then the last volume of The Principles of Sociology. His Principles of Ethics is even better. And the thing about Social Statics is that what that meant for Spencer is not that what is stable is what should be stable in a society, and what should be stable is a basic legal political order with rights embodied. And the idea that he advanced, and I clarified in my mind by contemplating some of the stuff in principles of sociology, but also in a lot of economics, is that what liberty does is that it burdens people the least and down equally, so that people are not overly burdened, but they also can't take away from the state or come to rely on the state very much. The idea in libertarianism is that you have a more stable society if people aren't all scrambling after the commons, after the resources in the commons, if they're not demanding so much of everybody. Now, one of the tricks that ideologues who love the state, who are statists, in a sense, one of their tricks is to pretend that the commons is magic and that you can just keep on drawing and drawing from it without really having to contribute to it, or else let those other people contribute to it. That's the problem. When you shift the burden of the commons onto others and try to withdraw as much for yourself, either yourself personally or in your group, this is the source of conflict. In monocultural societies, people have ways of restraining themselves from denuding the commons of resources. You don't want to be seen as a moocher because you respect others. But in a plural society, you don't. You want to get as much from the other guy as possible. That's what happens, and that leads to conflict in society. And Rabushka and Shepsle do a very good job demonstrating just how awful that can be in terms of violence. But we're seeing it now also in violence, but mainly we're seeing this in the complete lunacy of increasing the debt burden of the United States. Less and less are we concerned with taxes because fewer and fewer people want to pay them. Rationally, they don't want to pay them because the burden is getting too much. And since we're not a monoculture, but a maxiculture, or a pluralistic society, people still want to draw, but they don't want to have to pay into it. This is the eternal battle, and it doesn't work. It is actually a bad system, and we only exist as a society now because a small portion of the population is so amazingly productive, and a quarter of the population is genuinely productive, and the rest of us, we sort of glide right around it. We are the commensals and symbionts, and mostly parasites on their productivity. And the thing that people who love the state want to do is they want to make sure you never address this problem, because you see it would be bad to address reality. That's why one of the reasons Democrats these days are so crazy is they love the state. They love what the state can provide, and they love also burdening other people. And of course they will histrionically submit to some burdens themselves. You'll often see this virtue signaling, submitting to extra burdens. The masks is a grand example. They don't work. The extreme mitigation efforts by various countries, you can look at the curves, and the mitigation efforts don't really do much to change the curve of the contagion. Indeed, it's never really been flattened. So the curve's not been flattened and people's lives have not been saved, but it really is a cool way for people who are virtue signalers, and that's mainly what on the left and any statist really is, because they must not accept an actual burden. They must accept fake burdens so they can prove themselves just and then require you to do something extra. And if you don't like the burden that they submit to readily, because they, for instance, are virtue signaling and get their jollies off of it, but the other person may have a hard time, let's say, breathing through the mask, which many of us do, well, that's just too bad for you. And this is the insanity of our time. So that's kind of my the Theory of Democratic Instability, which is the subtitle of this book, helps explain the democratic insanity of our times. So what I have here is a conjecture, a theory of democratic insanity. And this is right along lines of what Volney talked about in The Ruins of Empires. This is not a new thing. This has been understood for a long time. But you have to admit that much of modern ideology is really trying hard to make sure that you never think about that. The thing they don't want you to think about are the ratios between producers and consumers. And I don't mean producers and consumers on the market so much as producers and consumers overall. If you have some people who basically just take and never give, this is a problem for society. And the ratio, when it's small, is fine, because there's always going to be children who have to be supported. That's actually a basic law of life, according to Herbert Spencer, is that the children have to be supported in reverse ratio to their merit, that is, what they bring to the table, and adults have to be treated according to merit. Now, the grave part of the situation is when you get very, very old, you can't contribute to either. The traditional way of handling this, of course, is for your children, the surviving children, to help you in your old age, and also to save. Well, you can't save in an inflationary society. That makes no sense. And Social Security has made it so that the ties between generations have pretty much been lost, and therefore we have a system of cradle and grave socialism, that is transfer state, where the public bears much of the cost. Much of the cost of birthing, much of the cost of education is being borne by the state. Not well, but it is being borne, and that encourages people to behave differently. In fact, less responsibly. We're less responsible now, and one of the reasons people have fallen for the insane and idiotic pandemic panic is that they're irresponsible, because they've been made irresponsible for generations of the welfare state. This is not a good thing. It's not good for us. It hasn't made us more robust. It certainly hasn't made us anti-fragile. They've made us fools. And as Spencer put it in one of his early pieces, the ultimate result of shielding men from the effects of folly is to fill the world with fools. We're there. A world full of fools is no way for a world to be. Thanks to Paul Jacob for stopping by, and I would like to invite everyone to go to locofoco.locals.com or meet us at locofoco.us.